Hello and welcome to the Miko Bits show. And I'm your host, Miko Bits. And today we have an exciting episode, which is Samson Mao, who's the CEO of Pixelmatic. And they're actually building a AAA class gaming experience that's massively multiplayer, oriented around a space theme. So it's extremely exciting to see. I think we're actually going to get some great conversations about disruption to the gaming market. So, I'm really excited to have this experience. So, so I guess without further ado, let's just jump right into it. Hey, Samson, how are you?
Good, thanks. Thanks for having me on, Miko.
I'm super excited to talk about this. I've been kind of getting some things on Twitter about the game, and it looks amazing to date. So, would love to just have you talk about the game and introduce us to what about what you're building.
Yeah, so Infinite Fleet is a MMO strategy title. Originally, our focus was more like MMO RTS, but it's kind of evolved since then. We just call it an MMO strategy game now. There are still very RTS-like elements in there. We want a component of base building and battling. And unlike a traditional RTS where you're kind of managing both at the same time, we wanted to separate the two elements. So, you're building your base up, you're building maybe a defensive battle platform or a space station or a mining station or something like that. But then, the combat is happening elsewhere. So we don't want you to be like juggling between building and fighting. It's more about, how space warfare might happen and being as realistic as possible. So you wouldn't be, producing and fighting at the same time. And that ties into also what we want to deliver visually, which is a cinematic experience. So if you ever watched Star Wars or anything, there's a battle sequence and it's great. And they're over the curvature of the planet and there are ships shooting at each other. But then it ends really quickly and you're left wanting more. So one of the goals for us is that we can deliver that consistently. So a lot of the combat will be very visceral and very visual.
That's very exciting, right? Because I think, when you talk about like Star Wars, in some ways it's almost like the classic opening sequence, right? Which is that what you see in Star Wars is you see the title crawl and you end up with kind of this you get the feeling of what's happening in the plot action, right? And then you go to a starfield, obviously, and then you kind of drop camera down, you see the planet curvature, and then it's like space battle, right? Like yeah. That's the classic Star Wars, right? So like it's exciting to hear that you're trying to go for sort of cinematic, and that really speaks to sort of the triple A quality of what you're doing. So a quick question. So, with respect to kind of the gameplay that you're talking about, like, it feels like there's sort of like, I guess these titles that are more like Alpha Centauri, or there's precedent titles like EVE Online. Like, I imagine that there's some kind of precedent way of thinking about like what you're doing, right? I think you've kind of pulled back a little bit from kind of like maybe more like RTS, like StarCraft type action. But like, how would you see kind of these big economy expansion style, and how would you see kind of the precedent there, especially with the economics?
Right. So I definitely think there is some influence from EVE Online. Like they were a trendsetter back in the day for sci-fi space battle games, right? But I think they're also a bit too hardcore and inaccessible for your typical player. Like you mentioned, there is a strong economic component in there, and people have likened playing EVE Online to like playing a spreadsheet but with a space background, right? And I had a friend that used to play EVE Online pretty hardcore, and he went on vacation sometime. We used to work together at Ubisoft, and he asked me, like, can you manage my stuff for me while I'm gone? And I said, okay. And I didn't know what I was getting into. So that was my experience playing EVE. But it was a lot of like clicking and dragging and managing timers and balancing resources. And personally, I didn't find that fun. I think their graphics are good, and I think there is a very cinematic quality to some of their battles too. But the amount of effort you have to invest in it, just playing the spreadsheet game to get those epic battles, is disproportionate in my view. And that's also what we want to fix in Infinite Fleet. We want you to have more time in that cinematic battle experience versus managing and balancing your resources. And for that part, I think it can be done that can be more automated. You can have mobile apps that help you manage it on the go. But generally, like, we want you to have that combat and have that experience more so than Eve. The other part about Eve Online is that it's a sandbox type game, but when you have a sandbox game, it can also be detrimental to the experience for the players too, because they don't really know what to do. Like, there's often an analogous saying, when you play Eve, it's like getting tossed into the game, and you have to deal with different mafias or join one of the mafias yourself.
Yeah.
Right?
Oh yeah, it's very. I've never played it, but that's totally the reputation, right? Which is you have to. It's join or die, right?
Yeah. So we want to find a happy medium where it's open-ended and the players can decide what they want to do, but there is a kind of a guiding rail to this, so you don't have to fend for yourself immediately. So I would say it's a happy medium between World of Warcraft and EVE Online, because we want to bring this genre to the mass market and have millions and millions of players playing this game. But throwing you into to be fed to the sharks is not the best way to do that. The other part, and I think we're addressing this as part of the whole MMO genre as a whole, is that when you play these games, so I was a very hardcore Lineage player. You play these games, you put years of your life into them, and when the game is shut down or the server shut down, you're kind of left with nothing. So what we are trying to implement is this thing called a directed narrative. And this is kind of akin to Dungeons and Dragons, where you have a dungeon master tailoring a story for you. So in this case, for Infinite Fleet, we are the dungeon master, and we set objectives, and the players can choose which objectives they tackle in which order. And there is a real chance to succeed and fail in these objectives, and that will decide what happens next in the story. But we're not writing everything down ahead of time and creating all these quests, but rather we're going to craft them as we go. And the idea is that you as a player get to become part of the lore. Your alliance, we call them divisions, they become part of the lore too. So as we roll out the story, you're woven into that. So let's say in 20 years, you're retired from gaming. You can look back and have the story that your character was a part of that story, or your guild or alliance was actually in that story, and there's something there. And potentially we could package those up into novels too. So you could actually have like a print book with your character in there and show your kids, like, I played this game and this is what I did.
Wow. So this is really exciting to hear about. And, I understand that you've got a little bit of like gameplay video for us, right? So I'd love to kind of have you tell us a little bit about what we're about to see.
Yeah, so this is new footage. We haven't actually shown video of our gameplay yet. So this is the first time we're airing gameplay video. So what you're seeing here is basically combat. We have our devs and designers playing together. And if you watch carefully, you can see like the camera. We spent a lot of time tweaking the camera, getting it just right. And you can zoom in and zoom out very fluidly. So there is a tactical view where you have a view of the entire battlefield, and you can zoom in and get that cinematic feeling that we were discussing earlier.
That's amazing. So really look forward to getting this sneak peek on this never before seen footage. I think camera becomes incredibly important when you're dealing with space battles, because in a way, like there's so many degrees of freedom with a camera. So like if your camera's wrong, like it just kind of really messes with your head, right? Like you're just looking at something very wrong. On the flip side, there's some incredible views that you could potentially generate that are just really novel, like underside views or things that you might not expect to see. So I'm really looking forward to having a look. So so we're gonna roll the trailer now, and and then we'll be right back. Okay, so one of the things I'm really excited to kind of understand from you is, you're talking about kind of optimization of the game for kind of people who are not kind of super experienced, right? Because obviously EVE Online is, you're talking about that experience of your friend where it's basically like, you throw in the deep end of the pool, right? You're just like, what is even happening? So I guess to me, the thing that's interesting about this mainstreaming effect is kind of how do you see the kind of blockchain-ish element, like how what's your view of all of that?
So we're taking a novel approach with our application of blockchain technology. So we're following this. So there is a crypto element to the game. We're following
Right.
a dual token model. So what that is we have a security token for fundraising and raising capital. To date, we've raised about 3.1 million in an oversubscribed round, and that is how we're funding it. And we're launching a second round soon on Stalker. They're a platform based out of Luxembourg, and we have a utility token in the game. So the idea is that there's a clear separation between these tokens. One is a security, and there is no getting around that. It's going to be Reg A plus filing with SEC, and it'll be issued in Europe under Luxembourg law. But then you have the utility token, which is a pure utility token that is not sold by us or by anyone else. It is generated by the players playing the game, in which we call proof of participation. So the idea is that you cannot farm this utility token. It's called INF. You have to earn it by social and group activities. So if you have a massive raid, one of those objectives we talked about as part of that directed narrative, if you gather like 3 different guilds or alliances or divisions, and you go and tackle this, and that's a couple hundred people, and you actually can siege this world and take it back from the Aatrox, then everybody that actually really participated will actually get a payout of INF token. So it is replacing basically World of Warcraft Gold or Lineage 2 Adena with a crypto asset that is portable for the players. They can take it out of the game if they want, or store it in a wallet. It's based on the Liquid network, so it has the token has the same security properties as Bitcoin does. It can have hardware wallets, multi-sig, etc.
Wow, that's really exciting. So one of the brief things that we did touch upon and that we've been doing quite a lot of focus on my show is actually the non-fungible token, or NFT, right? And I know that before the show we were talking about kind of how you have a very unique perspective on NFTs. So I would love to hear your unique perspective.
Mm-hmm.
So tell me about how do you see NFT?
Yeah, so we've had some people talk to us and say, you should make the ships NFTs in Infinite Fleet, because we will be selling ships. But I think we're going to take a different route. We're talking with Daniel Buchner from Microsoft. He's working on decentralized identity. And I think that is the route we're going to go for how to effectively, quote unquote, tokenize the ships. So the ships will be unique and they'll have an identity. So as you trade these on the peer-to-peer auction house, you can have that record of who owned it before you, and potentially metadata about what that ship did, which battles it was in. But it is not like an NFT per se. The reason I'm not a big fan of NFTs is because, none of these games are open source projects that I've seen so far. They all have terms and conditions and ownership of art. And you can say like, this is real ownership, and because you have this token, you have this, this Pikachu in the game. Yeah. But if the game developer shuts down the game, or they shut down themselves, what are you left with? And reading some of those terms of services, they say like the artwork is ours, and you don't own it. So you're left with a token that kind of points to nothing once the game is gone. So I think it's an interesting mechanism to help trade things and provide that portability, but it's not really ownership. It's more about facilitating trade.
Got it. It's it's fascinating to me though, because it sounds like what you're extracting though is from a different kind of style or technology base, that you're extracting some of the same properties of true ownership and of kind of recording of history. Is that accurate to say?
Mm-hmm.
So good, good. So, because I feel like, to me, the long lasting value of true ownership absolutely ties to the recording of history, right? Because as you talked about, you're talking about kind of the development of player lore, right? And you're talking about this kind of game universe, like a Star Wars type of universe, where you might even see the generation of novel characters and novel battles and novel history, right? So the idea that you're able to own kind of ships that have this unique battle history and have this unique characteristic is something that I think people might value more and more, right? So so to me, the being able to get the economic model right is super interesting, regardless of the underlying technology. So quick comment from you. I'm super curious about kind of how do you see the kind of notion of these durable cryptographic ownership? Like, how do you see that as impacting the kind of business models for gaming in the big picture?
Well, it's interesting to see what will happen. Like we talked about this in the preamble, which is the giants like EA, Activision, and Ubisoft. They
Yeah.
probably aren't really going to get into this. You know, I doubt like the next Blizzard MMO is going to be using a crypto asset
No
for their
chance.
game currency, right?
Yeah.
They're very complacent, and there's no need for them to change their model, right? When you're the dominant player, just using that pre-existing model is fine. And that pre-existing model where nothing is portable, it kind of benefits the game publisher or developer, right? So if me as a player, I buy some game currency and it's stuck to my account and I can't actually sell it on the secondary market. Whether people do or do not is a separate issue, but by the terms of service, you cannot sell that currency.
Sure.
Then effectively, you're locking it up, and when I stop playing, it's just locked up. I can't cash out or get rid of that and take back the value I put into it. So it's better for the developer and the publisher in that model, but it's not better for the player. So we're hoping with our model being more open, being more accepting that there will be secondary markets, and just allowing them that freedom, I believe, is the better way forward. And I think it will disrupt some of those incumbents, similar to how Bitcoin is disrupting the central banks and those incumbents. Like the freer money always wins. So the idea is that if we can pull this off and make this AAA massively multiplayer game with a freer economy, then we should be able to beat some of those older dinosaurs.
Yeah, I'm very excited to hear you speak this way, because for me, my way of looking at this is very much from my long background in open source software, right? And the thing that's so interesting about where open source software beats proprietary software is very much in this kind of like ownership, right? Which is that you gain kind of open license, right? So in a sense, like it's free software, right? But the point is that the freedom is free as in free beer, but it's also free as in freedom, in the sense that like you can really own and control this intellectual property, right? And to me, the thing that's super exciting is absolutely what you're talking about, which is inclusion, right? Because for me, the thing that's so fascinating about exactly what you're referring to is that the complacent studios, like, they don't want to give the users ownership of anything, because why should they, right? It's kind of like, that's mine, I own it, and you don't own it, and that's my power. So like, I have no incentive at all, right? But the thing that's exciting is that if you're able to give users a taste for true ownership, like my gut feeling is that they're never going to go back, right? Like it's a scorched earth, right? You're basically just like, would you like to go from non-ownership to ownership, like just as a phase change. So I guess for me, the thing that's really interesting is like, how do you see the future of this business model? Because I think we've seen so many models, and I think the dominant model today is free to play, right? That's the dominant model, and I think it's polluted partly by things like pay to win, so there's all these kind of weird models. The other day I interviewed Gabby from YGG, and he was talking about play to earn, which is kind of a new model, so I guess how do you see the business model changing, after Infinite Fleet?
Well, I think there's always been pay to earn. It's just people do it through secondary markets, right? Like World of Warcraft Gold, before they massively inflated the supply, there was a very burgeoning economy. People will buy WoW Gold to get ahead. pretty much every MMO game, people found a way to create a secondary market and effectively play to earn. So I don't think that's a really new thing. And to one of the points you touched on earlier, giving the players ownership, like that is actually one of the parts that I think a lot of the NFT game companies is misleading people, because unless your game is open source, then there is no ownership. Like unless you can fork that game and create a clone of it with all the artwork, then I don't think you really own it. You just have portability now, right? And ease of trade. So I think it's really in the marketing and the terminology that things get mucky.
I think there's two dimensions, right? Like we were interviewing Kurt Braggett from Nifty Wizards, right? And one of the things that's novel about his model is that, in fact, yes, like the actual gameplay functionality is proprietary and the software is proprietary. But what's interesting is that the metadata remains on chain. Right. But in some ways, like obviously the graphics and the imagery are not, right? So at that point, what you own is you kind of own something that maybe has a limited transferability, but it's more like you're owning this kind of intellectual concept, right? So what I mean by intellectual concept is it's possible for someone to launch a game on top of that blockchain platform and then maybe redo the art and say like, oh, if you own this kind of epic sword, I'm going to redo the art, and maybe my game is going to be like 3D or whatever, but like we're going to basically do this thing of chain splitting where we're basically like, well, if you owned any of that stuff, you're going to own the equivalent stuff in my new game, right? So it's sort of, there's an element where you can kind of sort of steal some of the ownership and give it to the users, but I agree with what you're saying, right? Which is that the more you transfer intellectual property rights, like graphics. So my question to you would be, how do you transfer graphics? Like, how do you transfer the art? Like, how does the art travel with the ownership in your game?
Well, I think for that part, you can look to some of the NFT artists, right? There are people tokenizing their artwork, and they're very clear on that. Like, if you buy this art token, you own this piece of art. Now, there's this whole shady business of Ethereum NFT art pieces being just stolen from stock art websites, but that's a separate issue altogether, right? Like, if you look at the actual spirit of the idea, it should be like, if you bought this token, you own this art, or you bought this token, you own a fraction of this art if it was, tokenized and broken down into lots of small pieces. But I think that is what you have to build into games. If you are saying you have true ownership, then that art is now owned by that player, and it should be reflected in the terms of service. And you should be able to use that art how you see fit. And I think if you made that change, I would have a lot more respect for the games that market themselves as you have ownership.
So to me, there's two elements to that, right? One of the elements to that is that there's some form of intellectual property license agreement, or there's some agreement that the user gets, right? Because one of the weird things that Jake Bruckman was talking about is he was talking about basically rebuilding the entire internet around intellectual property rights, right? And so the thing that happens with that is you have to have some kind of a license file, right? You have to have a file that basically says, yes, in fact, you do own this asset. And the second thing that has to come with it is maybe a data file, right? So I guess my question would be like, are you doing stuff like that where you're giving the user access to the data file, whether it's a 3D model or what the underlying asset is, right. and then what about licensing? Like, do you give the user license as well?
Right. So for Infinite Fleet, that is not something we're marketing, right? So the whole crypto asset part is actually not in your face. So when you first load up Infinite Fleet, what you see is a AAA game experience, and hopefully we'll be able to port to PlayStation, other consoles too. But the crypto component is more of a Trojan horse. You will earn INF, but you don't need to set up a wallet right away and write down your seed phrase or even buy any crypto to play the game. You just earn INF, and if you choose to take it out of the game, then you kind of initiate a withdrawal. So the model we're working with is more of an exchange-based model where you withdraw and deposit, just so that there is no barrier to entry to a player, because our goal is to be mass market, and I don't believe that we can be mass market if we add this friction and put the blockchain in your face and say, buy some Bitcoin or buy some whatever before you can play this thing, right? That's a massive red flag, I think, to a lot of people. But to the other point, we're not marketing this as, you own the ships forever. So we're not planning to open source the models or give license to that, because that's not what we're selling. It is, you buy the ship, you can use the ship in the game, but, eventually if the game does sunset in 10, 20 years, then, those things will disappear. And we're not saying that you own them forever. So I think it's okay that we're not giving people the 3D models.
Yeah, I mean, one way that could be dealt with in some ways is that if you do have a commercial like experience of this evolution, right? Like one of the things that happens is that there are almost like fan servers, and so there may come a time when if you may decide to do stuff like that. You may decide to kind of create an open source repository of the art and just be like, if you if you own the asset itself, like maybe someone else can make a fan server, or they could like there, because that happens, right? And one of the things that's always been a challenge is, like, for example, one of the things that happened is the first instance of World of Warcraft Classic was actually a fan server, and that Blizzard basically crushed it, right? Blizzard just showed up and they're like, you're not allowed to do this.
Well, then they did it themselves.
And then of course they did it themselves, and they commercialized it, right? They're basically like, you are not allowed to do that for your enjoyment. You only can do it for our profit. So we're going to run it. We're going to run World of Warcraft Classic, right? So, but to me, the thing that's really interesting about the kind of mindset could be like, that could be a Destiny, right? It could be one Destiny where you're like, okay, well, we just want to open this up enough that fan created environments can take advantage of all of the art, or, and maybe even the advances in the technology, right? Because someone could say, maybe 5-10 years from now, they could basically re-render the models in maybe an environment that they update.
Yeah, it's definitely possible. And down the road, that's something that we can explore. I just think it's really difficult for an MMO game to be run by the community. There's like a lot of server architecture, a lot of maintenance. You have to take security into consideration. If you have a centralized account database, like, are you okay with some random guy having your account and your password and your email and, access to elements of your identity, right? So if it's a smaller game like breeding and trading, I think you could probably open source that and people could maintain that relatively easily. But I think for an MMO, it's going to be above the ability for community running it, or even the cost. Like some of these online games, not even MMOs, but just like say MOBAs, they can have server costs that rack up 100, 200K a month just to have that infrastructure operational for Asia.
Yeah, that's fascinating. Yeah, I mean, I agree with you, and I feel like what I'm really poking at is kind of the eventual idea of like an open source content platform that has and spawns multiple experiences, right? So you could have, like, if you look at the evolution of a game IP platform, like, for example, if you look at what Riot Games are doing with the intellectual property of League of Legends, is that they're kind of like Runeterra, and they're kind of doing like all of these card games, and they're doing multiple like auto chess battlers, like they're just taking the same character as an IP and they're just creating many different game experiences, right? So that's what I'm talking about. I'm talking about like there may end up being a card game that like is based on your ships, or so what I'm really thinking about this as more like platform perspective.
But what you actually mentioned there is a key reason why it's difficult to do, because IP ownership is a important part of the puzzle, right? If you don't have that IP, or you've effectively given the license for the IP, then technically anybody can take your IP and do something and compete directly with you. So, I'm pretty sure Riot, one day they're going to go and try to make a movie, right? Like World of Warcraft, they did their movie. So if you open your IP up and you no longer have ownership of your IP, some studio somewhere could just snap it up and say, okay, we're making a League of Legends movie now, and you don't get anything. And you have to be okay with that.
Yeah, and I think there's ugliness in there as well, obviously, right? Because I think that one of the things that's so interesting about the evolution of ancient kind of more open types of content platforms is that they can get kind of junky, right? Like if you look at stuff like Second Life or whatever, like you end up with these incredibly diverse art styles, and you just end up with something that just really has no coherence whatsoever, right? It just kind of really falls apart. And obviously that's very, very counter to the idea of like a AAA title, you know, because you're entering like effectively a cinematic universe, right? So like, you know, you wouldn't necessarily want these kind of hyper degenerate versions of experiences that kind of pollute or dilute your own IP. But I guess what I'm kind of poking at is that we may be in for kind of future scenarios where IP owners choose to open source things in a way to empower kind of much more open, kind of maybe fan generated or maybe semi-professional or even professional, like, you know, activities.
Yeah. But there are a lot of forces working against that too. So you mentioned like, you know, another company could take your NFT and make a new game around it, right? But the incentives are not aligned. So if they make a new game and they just like spend millions of dollars developing this game, and they say, okay, everyone that played game A, your NFTs are now usable in our game, then they just threw away all that monetization capability for selling those assets to the player, right? Which game A did already. So it's kind of like, if you go back to the cryptocurrency space, why do people make new forks and, you know, airdrop the coins and try to build their own economy versus joining that project and building on top of that project? Because the incentive is better for me to take your code, fork it, rebrand it, and say, you know, it's better than project A. Buy my token, buy my shitcoin.
Yes. Agree. Which to me, we're already seeing in DeFi with the vampiric fork, right? We're already seeing quite a bit of that economically incentivized behavior, which is basically like, I'm just going to clone it, right? Because what happens then is that you create a parallel universe, and you're basically like, say, you're trying to really just steal the user, right? You're basically just trying to say, like, you know, the past 10 years you've been building items in this game, like, we're not going to set you back. Like, you know, you're going to start our game with all of that stuff, you know, and then you have to have excitement and confidence that once you've jumped over to us, that you're going to be able to keep going and it's going to be fun and good for you. Right. So I agree with you that could happen.
But there is a scenario where I could see that happening, which is within a massive game publisher. So the publisher of Infinite Fleet is called Exordium. That's why the security token is called EXO. But the idea is that Exordium is publishing Infinite Fleet first, and Exordium will publish other games. But within the circles of one publisher, they might try to incentivize cross-game adoption. Like let's take Ubisoft, for example, because I used to be at Ubisoft. So you used to play Rainbow Six. Now you can take some of your NFTs and use it in Ghost Recon or something like that, right? So within their own ecosystem, they may do it. But I don't think there will be portability between like the Ubisoft ecosystem and the EA ecosystem. You know, that's just, the incentives are not aligned in that place. But within one publisher's, you know, library of games, they might try to do that to increase retention.
Yeah. I like the idea. I like what you're saying, right? Because at some level, like, you know, we are already seeing that kind of behavior of, you know, like I mentioned kind of Riot Gaming and looking at League of Legends, right? So there's very much, I mean, they're not having transferability of assets across the titles, but they are preserving intellectual property and characters across the titles to create a kind of a cinematic universe and completely different in-game experiences, whether it's auto battlers or collectible card or whatever kind of game experience or kind of traditional esport, right? So I guess you know, the logical extension of that would be like transferability of like skins or owned assets, like, you know, across these different environments, right? So you could be like, oh, I own this skin that's a, you know, League of Legends skin, and I'm going to put it onto my, you know, Runeterra playing card character, you know, in order to change the appearance of the card. Or, with all of that kind of stuff. But, you know, which would add value to the skin, right? So you'd be like, oh, that skin is worth more now, right? So you know, so I definitely see that direction, you know, and I think this is all like an incredibly rich experiment with kind of what players can experience, you know. So I guess for me, what's the kind of like timeline for Infinite Fleet? Like, you know, I'd love to kind of round off with that and try to get a feeling.
Yeah, so we're aiming for alpha at the end of this year. Hopefully, we won't slip, fingers crossed. And then beta will be sometime next year. But during alpha, we plan to have several updates. So the first iteration of alpha will probably let in 100, 200 people. And every update of alpha will subsequently add a couple hundred more people just to ramp up our server infrastructure and testing, making sure we're able to support that many players. But it's debatable if beta is going to be official launch or what. But beta is typically launch for a lot of projects. But we haven't decided if beta is actually launch or if there's like an official launch date.
Well, one of the really exciting trends that we've been seeing in the kind of indie space is we've been seeing lots of kind of like public beta games, like if you look at it like a game like Factorio, like they basically had the word beta on their title for like years, almost like it was almost like Gmail having the word beta on it for like a really long time, where you could just buy the game in beta, right? And people would just play it and buy it. And, and at the end, they basically were like, we're going to remove the word beta when we feel like the thing has everything that you could possibly hope and expect to see, right? So these models allow you to really soft launch, and when you look at Kickstarter, like there's certain indie titles like Darkest Dungeon, which I'm a fan of, like just did a board game and they raised 1.8 million just on the pre-game Kickstarter, right? So the game doesn't even exist and they're already like people engaging it, like they're heavily engaging it. So
Star Citizen has raised 300 million and there's no game either.
Exploding. The scale of what you're talking about is phenomenal. So that's a beautiful thing, right? I mean, it shows to me that what we're seeing is an expansion of the age, the wealth, the kind of engagement, and kind of how important these user bases are economically now, right? Because players of all ages and all economic statuses are just starting to jump in, and they're really passionate about having these experiences.
Yeah.
Well, this has been super great. I enjoyed quite a lot, and I'm super looking forward to kind of having these in-game experiences because, I think you're absolutely pioneering the business models, and you're absolutely pioneering an ownership model for this kind of game.
Yeah, thank you, Miko. Hopefully, we'll get some rave reviews of Infinite Fleet.
Yeah, I'm excited to play. So I'll see you on there.
All right, thank you.
Okay, bye.